As soon as Magic Johnson, the basketball superstar and all-around good guy, announced that he had tested positive for the HIV virus, my phone started to ring. Conventional information says that this HIV virus causes AIDS, and a chemical called AZT is the prescribed treatment. But the callers, all of whom love Magic Johnson, wanted me to warn him away from taking AZT. They may have read a book called Poison by Prescription by John Lauritsen, or they may have seen Dr. Peter Duesberg in May of 1991 on this series. I am repeating that two-part series in order to comply with their requests and to offer Magic Johnson a second opinion, something that is frequently missing in the medical scientific community's treatment of AIDS. In part one, Dr. Duesberg will say that the HIV virus does not cause AIDS, not without a cofactor anyway. Rather, that it is an antibody, the body's best protection. If HIV virus acted like a conventional virus, he believes, it would have spread far beyond the high-risk groups, but it did not, as government officials predicted in 1983. He will say that the $3 billion in research to find a vaccine is wasted, because the vaccine is already there. Dr. Duesberg also says that AZT, the chemical that Magic Johnson is now taking or getting ready to take, was developed exclusively to kill bone marrow cells and lymphocytes, the only known result of which is to terminate life. In other words, if the HIV virus does not kill you, which is debatable, AZT surely will. Next week, he will tell you why it is so difficult for men to get AIDS from women. Only 2.2% of AIDS cases are transmitted that way. Who is this man that dares to challenge the entire medical establishment and has offered to be inoculated with the AIDS virus to prove that it does not cause AIDS? Dr. Duesberg has been a molecular biologist at the University of California at Berkeley since 1964, a member of the prestigious National Academy of Science, one of the world's most respected retrovirologists. He discovered the viral gene that can cause cancer and is the first person to draw a genetic map of a retrovirus. Impressed? Many of the members of the medical research establishment once were, before he opposed their pet theories about HIV and AIDS. They now call him an academic jerk and refuse to continue the funding for his research after 22 years of continuous support. If Duesberg is right, the federal medical establishment is wrong. And if their 7-year-old hypothesis that the HIV virus causes AIDS is wrong, thousands more will become the ultimate victims of what Duesberg believes is a cofactor associated with drugs and or malnutrition. I'm Tony Brown. We'll be back with Hunting the Virus Hunter.
Tony Brown's Journal is brought to you by Pepsi and its bottlers. This program is part of Pepsi-Cola's continuing support of your community's cultural, educational, and business interests.
Our guest on this program is Dr. Peter Duesberg. Dr. Duesberg, we're going to deal with a heavily complicated, intricate subject. And I've spoken with you on a number of occasions, and you're an extremely learned man. But for our television audience, we're going to try to break it down. Let's start with some fundamentals. Number one, what is the government's hypothesis? What drives the research of the federal government as to the cause of AIDS?
The hypothesis now, the leading hypothesis, in fact the only hypothesis, is that AIDS is solely the consequence of infection by this AIDS virus or HIV, human immunodeficiency virus.
In other words, if you have the AIDS virus, the official position is you have AIDS.
You will have AIDS within 10 years with a 50 to 100% certainty. That's the official line.
Now, what is your theory, your hypothesis?
That AIDS virus is not the cause of AIDS and cannot be the cause of AIDS. Something else altogether is the cause of AIDS. In America and in Europe, it's somewhat different in Africa.
Why is it that HIV virus does not cause AIDS?
Well, there are 3 reasons that I could name that are the most telling reasons why AIDS virus cannot be the cause of AIDS. Unless that virus is unlike any other virus we have ever seen, and we have seen many, many viruses and studied many of them, it is impossible for it to cause AIDS. Viruses are very tiny things, much, much smaller than we are. You can only see them with an electron microscope. So for a virus to cause a disease in a man or in an animal, many, many viruses got to get in there and work on us. They have to tie us down like the little dwarfs tie down Gulliver. One dwarf could never do it. You need thousands to pull us down. In fact, you need billions and millions in viruses. Dwarfs, you need fewer, because they're actually considerably bigger than a virus ever will be. So when we have influenza, we have billions, trillions of viruses replicating, growing in our lungs and destroying the tissues in there. If we have hepatitis, you have billions of hepatitis virus particles chewing up your liver. Or if you have herpes lesions, you have again billions of herpes viruses actively eating up your cells, and you hurt. But with AIDS virus, that is the only virus that is said to cause a fatal disease. You're dying from a horrible disease, and the virus can never be seen. It can hardly ever be seen. Only the most expensive laboratories in the country, the best equipped laboratories, like Gallows at the NIH, for example, can ever find a tiny trace of the virus. All they ever find here is, in fact, with the AIDS test, is neither the virus, it is antibody to the virus.
An antibody.
A neutralizing antibody.
Tell us what an antibody is. The AIDS virus is an antibody.
Antibody is the body's response to an infection by a microbe. That's the defense department of the human body or the animal body. Those are the soldiers, the freedom fighters of the body that deal with the enemy, hand to hand or gun to gun. That's the response in our body to deal with the virus. When you were young, or I was young, we were artificially inoculated with attenuated viruses, polio virus, measles virus, mumps virus, to elicit that response, to ask our body, now see what you got, what you could possibly be infected by later on, that could be bad, make antibodies to it. Once you have made those antibodies, you are protected for the rest of your life. And here we are saying that's the second reason why the AIDS virus doesn't make any sense as a cause of AIDS. We are saying when we are finding these antibodies, you don't have AIDS yet, but wait a minute, 5 or 10 years from now, you're doomed. Then you're going to get sick. There is no other virus that behaves that way. Viruses hit before the immune response, not after. Once you have antibodies, you're protected, you're vaccinated. Your doctor will give you a certificate, you're vaccinated against polio. You won't get polio now, or against measles or mumps or pox viruses. And here we're turning that rule upside down. For the first time in the last 200 years of research, we are saying you have antibody to a virus, you have been infected, 10 years later you're going to be dead. Makes absolutely no sense. It is the best protection against the virus you could possibly have. And there's a third reason, and this is actually also the reason why the antibodies don't protect against the disease, because something else must cause that disease, and why nobody has come up with a vaccine. Despite a $3 billion research effort, we have never come up with a vaccine, because all we ever find with the AIDS test is our own vaccine. And there is no better vaccine than our own vaccine. You can't improve on your own vaccine. That's the best defense you could ever have, and that's why they never come up with a vaccine. They spent $1 billion on it, but they can't find one because it's already there. And now the third reason is there is no virus on this planet that we have ever seen, and unless it's HIV, where like no other virus ever before, that takes 10 years from an infection on average to a disease. There is very little time that viruses have a free range in us to cause a disease. It is exactly, again, like our tiny little soldiers. They invade us today, and then they spread. Then they invade the lungs, or the immune system, or the liver, or any other part of your body, and they can get only that to a certain point, let's say to a third of your lung, if you're unlucky, and then there's so much there that the immune system says, there's something going on here, there's somebody in me, shouldn't be there, that's foreign. And then you respond. Then you make antibodies to it, and neutralize it, and either you win, and the show is over for the virus, or in very, very rare cases, it's the other way around. The virus wins, and then the show is over for you. And that takes, on the average, a couple of weeks. And that's exactly how long it takes for HIV. When you get infected, 2 papers just appeared in the New England Journal on that subject today. Within a few weeks, you have made an overwhelming immune response. You have made antibodies to that virus, which they said are extremely efficient and very rapidly acting, neutralizing that virus to a level where nobody can find it anymore, except if you go to the NIH and pay for an extremely complicated amplification test that can detect 1 virus particle in 1 million cells, which is far too little to cause any symptoms that you could ever notice as a human host. So this is the situation, and then you should get a disease before you make these antibodies, that is within weeks after infection, like with all other viruses, not 10 years later when nothing is left over.
Dr. Duesberg, why is it that we have a much larger percentage of AIDS cases in the homosexual and in the IV drug user communities?
That is, of course, first I should say that is not because of HIV, yes? That is because these groups must do something that the rest of the population is not doing. See, I came to the conclusion, based on the arguments I just mentioned briefly, that HIV cannot be the cause of AIDS. In fact, if you think it's so, is AIDS in fact an infectious or contagious disease? Can you acquire AIDS by contact, or can you acquire AIDS by any other method? It becomes very clear that AIDS cannot be acquired by a contact. There are 2 ways you can become sick, essentially, or an epidemic like AIDS could appear in a population. Either it is due to an infectious agent, or it is due to a toxic substance. If it's an infectious agent, everybody can get it. Infectious agents are not picky. They take young and old, male and female, black and white, and yellow and red. Anybody is good enough for them. They're not all that picky. And they in fact prefer the very young and the very old over the middle-aged people. But a toxic agent has a very different distribution. You can only get a tennis elbow if you are an active tennis player, and you almost only get lung cancer if you smoke a lot of cigarettes, and you almost only get liver cirrhosis if you are a heavy drinker. So you can distinguish an infectious disease from a non-infectious disease by looking at who gets sick. That's called epidemiology. That is done very carefully and very precisely right here in Atlanta by the Centers for Disease Control. I'm sure they're all here and want to talk to us now or in a minute. They're raising their arms. Now, they have very carefully demonstrated, exactly like Tony Brown pointed out, that AIDS doesn't affect the general population, that it's exclusively concentrated, almost exclusively, among IV drug users, about 30%, and 60% are male homosexuals. In fact, there are more interesting figures. 91% of all AIDS cases in America are males. Females have virtually nothing to say in the AIDS business. So that's a very odd distribution, totally incompatible with any infectious agent at all. Virus, microbe, nothing can fit that distribution. Maybe for a month or 2 or for a year, but not for 10 years. AIDS is now 10 years old in the US. It's got to be something else altogether. And I'm proposing most of AIDS in this country is the consequence of the ever-increasing consumption of psychoactive drugs, including cocaine and heroin, and also oral drugs like poppers, amyl nitrate inhalants that are used as aphrodisiacs and stimulants. And last not least, in the last 3 years and 4 years, ACT, which is used to inhibit HIV, but itself the most direct cause of AIDS. It was designed to kill lymphocytes, to kill the bone marrow, to kill the blood cells, and that's exactly what it does exquisitely well. So the reason why AIDS is in these groups, 30% of the AIDS patients in this country are confirmed intravenous drug users. That's the tip of the iceberg of drug consumption. For every intravenous drug user, you have at least 10 recreational oral drug users. And it takes much more oral drugs to get sick from than from injecting drugs. Now, why the homosexuals? Now, it's very important to point out that it's not every homosexual who gets AIDS. 10% of the male population in this country are homosexuals. That's roughly 8 million. Starting to count, we are 250 million, half of them are males, and homosexuality can only be told once you are at least at puberty, so that's around 80 million people. 10% is 8 million. So we have 8 million homosexuals in this country, and 20,000 homosexuals get AIDS. So it got to be something other than homosexuality, because only 0.2% of the American homosexuals ever get AIDS. Your all-American homosexual neighbor will never get AIDS. It's only the ones who have this enviable number of sexual contacts, like hundreds of thousands a year. And how is that achieved? Almost exclusively by chemicals, not by a good old testosterone. Testosterone is good for 2 or 3 dates, but not for hundreds or 200. It's exactly like in the Olympics. We run now 100 meters in 9.8 seconds, not on ATP, but we run on steroids and other chemicals. And it's the same in the bathhouses or in the whorehouses, wherever it is. You break the old records with new chemicals. And the price is that 10 years down the road, which is called the latent period of the virus, that is always asleep, even when you're dying from AIDS. It's dormant, it's undetectable. It's the chemicals that get you sick then. Then you die from AIDS. And the reason why homosexuals are nevertheless a relatively high percentage is because those homosexuals who have so many contacts use a lot of aphrodisiac drugs, such as poppers, so-called poppers, which are amyl nitrate inhalants, PCP, amphetamines, and in fact that has been all recorded by the Centers for Disease Control, but it is not ever listed as an AIDS cause. They use angel dust, they use cocaine, they use heroin, they use uppers and downers and Valium, and then the very conventional legal drugs included, like alcohol, to forget about all the bad feelings that are generated by them.
You draw a relationship between AIDS in homosexuals and Kaposi sarcoma, amyl nitrates?
Yes. See, among Americans infected by HIV, almost only the homosexuals develop ever Kaposi sarcoma. Again, CDC numbers, directly from Atlanta, right from here. So if you are infected by HIV and homosexual, you have a 20 times higher risk to develop Kaposi sarcoma than a junkie or a hemophiliac or a baby or whoever might get AIDS from HIV. And the reason is because the poppers are inhaled in large numbers. That's why it's called popper. It's a little ampule that they wear around the necklace filled with the nitrate gases, or the liquid, which are originally designed as a medication against angina or spastic conditions, also against heart attacks. They relax the muscles, and they are used by the homosexuals preferentially because they are aphrodisiac, but they facilitate anal intercourse, which is technically an important aspect, of course, in homosexual sex. So, and that's exactly where the amyl nitrate hits. It hits in the hand, in the face, and in the lung because it's inhaled. And that's why you see the Kaposi sarcoma in the hands, and the face, and in the lung, the so-called pulmonary Kaposi sarcoma, at a very high proportion, exclusively in the homosexuals, and not in the junkies or hemophiliacs.
And if the AIDS virus is not causing AIDS, why do we have an outbreak of what's called AIDS among heterosexuals in Africa?
Well, that's really a different story. It is an altogether different story. The AIDS is, the S in AIDS stands for syndrome, and a syndrome means a collection of diseases which are defined as the AIDS syndrome. And the CDC has thrown in 25 old diseases in that collection. All of them are old. None of these diseases are new. When those diseases occur in the presence of HIV, then the disease is called AIDS. In the absence, it's called by its old name. Now, such as dementia. If you have dementia with HIV, you have AIDS. If you have dementia without HIV, you're stupid, as it was in the last 2,000 years. If you have
pneumonia and you have the AIDS virus, you have what?
then you have AIDS.
If you have pneumonia and you do not have the AIDS virus,
You have pneumonia. Yeah.
so
And
they've
there's
done that.
no distinction. There's
They've done that,
nothing
you say,
which-
with 25 diseases,
Yeah.
and they call it the syndrome. Now, what about, how does that apply to Africa?
The first 90% of the AIDS diseases in this country are the pneumonia, the pneumocystis pneumonia, as it's called, a so-called wasting disease, which is similar to cancer. You lose weight, you can't keep your food. As the third one is candidiasis, and Kaposi sarcoma is a yeast infection of Kaposi. Those are the first 90%. Dementia comes soon. And lymphoma is one that's on the rise now, mainly because of ACT. ACT causes lymphoma, as in fact the director of the NCI has shown in a paper recently, 50%. Now in Africa, the big AIDS diseases, the first 90% among the list of 25 are totally different. None of them is the same as in this country or in Europe. In Africa, it's slim disease, which is not like wasting disease. I don't know exactly how it's different, but it's different from the wasting disease here. It's diarrhea, and it's fever and tuberculosis. Those are the classical diseases. Or in Africa, they are a consequence of malnutrition, parasitic infections, and poor hygiene.
Now, these are what you would call cofactors.
These are factors.
These are factors.
Cofactors of what? Of the fantasy HIV virus? I don't know.
So
they
you're
are
saying,
factors by
you're saying that
themselves.
people in Africa are dying of malnutrition,
Parasitic infections.
and if the AIDS antibody, which we call HIV, is present, we
Yes.
then describe that condition as AIDS.
Yeah, every time Dr. Gallo or Dr. Fauci take a trip to Africa, and their itinerary is subsequently reported in Science by Dan Koshland, we learn about a new AIDS belt, because they take along an antibody testing kit and test their friends down there, or go to the hospital. When it's positive, it's reported as a new AIDS belt.
All right, now,
Everybody who's getting sick there now by the old diseases is now an AIDS patient. So their AIDS diseases are totally different. They may well be in part infectious, or also due to environmental factors or toxins, if you want, but those are randomly available. Poor water, malnutrition, poor hygiene, and the parasites there, like malaria and what have you, are available to everybody. And that's why in Africa, young and old and male and female have AIDS all across the board.
Dr. Robert Gallo has a new book out, and he dedicates 10 pages to you. And obviously, he is not your fan, and nor are you his fan. Next week, you and I and a journalist from the Miami Herald will discuss what Dr. Gallo says about you. But before we close this program out, I want you to give us your opinion of the only federally approved treatment for AIDS, AZT.
Yeah, that is perhaps historically the worst outcome and the highest responsibility of those doctors, and Gallo is an MD, he prides himself, who have developed the virus AIDS hypothesis. Everybody can make a mistake here and there, and that hypothesis doesn't work. We spent $3 billion on AIDS research. We have not predicted AIDS right. We have not come up with a vaccine. We have not saved one single life, and we are currently treating 125,000 people with a substance that was exclusively developed to kill bone marrow cells and lymphocytes.
That's what AZT was designed to do.
That's what AZT is designed for. It is a terminator of DNA, which is the central molecule of life. If you terminate DNA synthesis, you terminate life. There is no way around it. It is as straightforward as cyanide. There's simply no other way around it. You can't even call it a side effect. That is the only known effect of AZT. And that substance is given in the hope that HIV causes AIDS, which has yet to be proven, and in the hope that this would now help those people who are infected by the virus. It fails entirely to consider that even in the worst cases of HIV infection, never more than 1 in 500 cells are ever infected, because, as I pointed out, so few viruses are around. So if you want to kill the one infected cell, assume for a second the virus is unquestionably the cause of AIDS. Let's say you want to knock that out, and you give it AZT. You can only, AZT cannot tell an infected from an uninfected cell. It's just a little chemical. It's not even as smart as the highly intelligent AIDS virus, as they always call it. So if you want to reach that cell, you have to kill 499 uninfected cells every time you want to kill an infected cell. That's what's called an extremely high toxicity index. That is, if you want to get one criminal, you shoot 500 people. just to get that one. They say he was in that village, in that club, okay, let's get him all, because he might be in there. Or
What happens after you take AZT over a period of time? How long can you take it if it's that toxic?
As I said, most people cannot stand it even for 2 weeks. Some people, fortunately, can stand it longer, or luckily can take it longer, because people differ in their ability to take it into the cell.
How many people are now receiving
Some
it?
luckily just piss it out, literally. It doesn't go in because it has to be actively pulled into your cell by a so-called kinase. And some people take it up very easily, and they sew up, and they lose their red cells very fast, and then they suffocate. But what the ACT researchers never acknowledge, or rarely ever point out, is to keep them alive, they constantly transfuse them. So they become literally Draculas in our hospitals and consume the blood supplies. And they don't consider that bad, and they keep them alive by artificially transfusing the red cells. And then within 6 months, mostly even these so-called beneficial side effects wear out, and then they usually deteriorate. They become worse than they would have been without the treatment. And what's published now is those who live longer on the drug survive longer. Then the drug acts as a carcinogen. Like all chemotherapy, it itself is carcinogenic. That drug in tissue culture is just as carcinogenic as methylcolantrine, which is one of the best carcinogens we have ever developed in tissue culture, that is in laboratory. And as Poda has just reported in the Journal of American Medical Association half a year ago, 50% of those who survive ACT for 2 or 3 years will develop lymphoma, which is an irreversible cancer condition. Whereas people who are not on ACT,
Dr. Duesberg, I hate to interrupt you, but we're going to continue this next week. And also, there's a new study in Los Angeles I want you to comment on next week.
That would be lovely.
Tony Brown Productions produces this program and is solely responsible for its content.
For over a decade, Tony Brown's Journal has been brought to you by Pepsi and its bottlers. At Pepsi-Cola, we're committed to the communities we serve and their cultural, educational, and business interests.
Tony Brown's Journal is available on video and audio cassette. To order, call 1-800-223-1796.
With a copy of the December 23rd, 1990 copy of the Miami Herald. In its magazine cover story, Eleanor Burkett begins on April the 23rd, 1984, with then Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler, and Dr. Robert Gallo of the National Cancer Institute, jointly announcing that the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, is the cause of AIDS, and that Gallo had discovered it. Secretary Heckler called it a miracle, a lasting tribute to American medicine and science. Within 6 months, a blood test would be available, Heckler said, and within 2 years, a vaccine would be ready for testing. 7 years later, there is none. Furthermore, this 1984 announcement that the HIV virus alone caused AIDS was made by America's top health officials prior to a single publication on the subject by Dr. Gallo or any American scientist, Dr. Peter Duesberg says. That, you might say, is how HIV was born, a phenomenon of science by press release, Duesberg adds. The HIV virus of Dr. Gallo, it was soon discovered, had already been discovered a year earlier by a Frenchman, Dr. Luc Montagnier. Since that turbulent birth and those rosy promises, the country has been pushed into a hysteria, waiting for an epidemic in the general population that never came. Then in June 1990, Dr. Montagnier, the discoverer of HIV, announced that he had been wrong. HIV, the so-called AIDS virus, does not cause AIDS alone. It is a benign virus that only becomes dangerous in the presence of a second organism, a cofactor called a mycoplasma, Dr. Montagnier now believes. Together, HIV and this microorganism cause the body's cells to burst. But when treated in the laboratory with tetracycline-type antibiotics, the bursting stopped. And for his departure from the traditional wisdom of establishment researchers, his findings are not taken seriously by the media, and his reversal on the cause of AIDS and the discovery of a cofactor have been virtually ignored. The media largely reports the theories of the officials who in 1984 promised us a still anticipated vaccine.
So what are we left with after 7 years and billions of dollars spent on research based on the theory that the HIV virus causes AIDS? Thousands dead, thousands sick and suffering, no vaccine,